I want to spend a few minutes today talking about international relations theory. The reason I want to do this is as a kind of a refresher because of the connections between international relations theory and international political economy. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 or 30 minutes is a lot of violence to everything that you spent an entire semester learning. I want to simplify and just remind all of you of what international relations theory is kind of about in some of its very simple terms, maybe too simplistic, and you'll regret taking some of your intro to IR theory. But at the same time, I want to remind everybody of the connections to IPE, and I want to really sort of give some insight into how I begin thinking about IR theory in the context of IPE. And so this is a cheap little primer. And it begins with the idea of a billiard table. And so if you think of the global system as a bunch of billiard balls rolling around the table, the big map, instead of a billiard table, a big map of the international system, map of the world. And the billiard balls are bouncing around the table, largely as we might think of them responding to the laws of physics by size, weight, velocity, momentum, so on. But in the case of the international system, we want to think about them in terms of the size of countries. Because one place that we begin when we think about the system, the international system, is with the state. That's one unit of analysis that we can focus on in trying to understand the international system. And so I've modified this billiard table in this slide to show this same map of the world with all these countries bouncing around and bumping into each other. But the larger circles are obviously the larger countries. And so you have countries that are composed of huge populations. They maybe have a large economy. They are powerful diplomatically. There's a whole bunch of components that go into a country's size and scale. And if you think about this in terms of a billiard table, you can see these larger billiard balls rolling around the table and conceivably riding roughshod over the smaller ones. The smaller countries really don't have much in terms of mass and size, capabilities, if we think about it in terms of the capabilities of states, in order to get their way. And so it becomes a kind of billiard table of countries made up of different sizes, momentums, power. And so if we think about the international system and we think about kind of ways to think about how the international system functions, realists, as we see here in this slide, they really take a very pessimistic view about human intentions, about the capabilities of states, and essentially the larger states made up of big populations, big economies, and importantly, large militaries, large, powerful militaries, roll around the table in a kind of might makes right sort of approach. The system is driven by self-interest, and so in this particular billiard table, you have this very large, dark blue, maybe navy colored state there in the bottom left-hand side of the billiard table. And the smaller states certainly are going to be run over in this kind of depiction of realism. The big states are going to just have their way. And there are a few big-ish states that may challenge that large blue state in the bottom left-hand corner. The characteristic here, though, of all of this is self-interest and self-help. No state is going to come to your interest. There is no RCMP or police force that's going to come and intervene in terms of the way these states move around this table. And that we refer to, as many of you remember, as anarchy. Anarchy is the prevailing kind of force or lack thereof between states. Within states, states have a predominance of power, but between the states, there's really very little that can drive or dictate what a state may do other than power. And so realists take a very dim view of the international system. They don't see a lot of cooperation taking place in between all of these billiard balls. And it's really only the large states that drive the system in terms of their interests. Well, again, realists think about power and the exercise of power and think about how those billiard balls move around the table, primarily on the basis of the scale of that power. Can you get your way? Do you have enough power to exercise that you can get your way in what is essentially an anarchic, and in this case, a zero-sum system, meaning anything that I lose, somebody else must be gaining. Anything that I can gain through the exercise of power, the accumulation of more power, means that somebody else has lost something. It's a zero-sum proposition that we see in the international system. Well, what about liberal theory or interdependence theory? Well, this is a different kind of interpretation of how the international system works, thinking about how states roll around the billiard table. Well, realists think that there's really very little, constraining the movement of states around the table. But liberal theory, interdependence theorists would say, wait a minute, there are actually a lot of other things that constrain states. There are norms of behavior. There are cobwebs of institutional connections, financial, economic, trade connections that really constrain the arbitrary movement of states based purely on power. And so they would argue that the system is not nearly as anarchic as some of their realist colleagues would have us believe. Well, so what are these norms? What are these limits? What are the connections between these states that limit that momentum of states bouncing around the table purely on the basis of power, purely on the basis of might makes right in a zero-sum anarchic system? Well, what are those things? Well, liberals, interdependence theorists would point to a whole range of formal kinds of institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund. These are organizations that are made up of big states and small states, and their rules, their norms of behavior within these organizations are some ways in which states are constrained in terms of their behavior. If you're a member of the United Nations, you agree to adhere to certain kinds of norms of behavior, diplomatic behavior, the prohibition against violations of sovereignty, for example. Any membership in these kinds of organizations inherently brings with it a set of rules that the state abides by. What about treaties? There are a whole range of treaties, whether they be nuclear weapons treaties, conventions like the Geneva Convention, or one recent institution that many people are interested in is the International Criminal Court, created in the late 90s, and it has been building a kind of credibility through case history, participation by states, that further enshrines the norms against the violation of human rights, for example. And so states, again, are kind of constrained in what they're actually doing. What about regionalism and liberalism? Well, we have all kinds of examples, and this gets us to a little bit of political economy. We have all kinds of examples of regional connections, political and especially economic. And so you see here depicted in this in this slide, the NAFTA area, for example, represented by the three flags of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. You've got the EU represented here. You got Mercosur, which is the common market of the Southern Cone. These are all primarily economic arrangements, but by the same token, they are also arrangements that by membership, you are agreeing to abide by a certain set of rules and norms of behavior in your economic arrangements that curb those arbitrary tendencies of states that realists would argue really drive the system. Liberal theorists say, no, not so fast. There are all kinds of strictures, cobwebs on top of the billiard table that are limiting the capacity of states to act in an arbitrary fashion. Here in this slide, what you see is the growth, certainly after 1990, 92, and the end of the Cold War. What you see here are the growth of regional arrangements. You see an explosion of this kind of regional integration, this membership in a whole array of regional economic bodies, such as the NAFTA, such as the EU, Mercosur. You see here in this slide just the explosion in these kinds of arrangements. There are dozens, hundreds of them that are now in existence, and more being negotiated all the time. And so again, these are the membership in these organizations. Liberal theorists would point to and say, hey, look, this is a way in which the state's behavior is quite significantly constrained. This is just another way to kind of put it. Here we have this spaghetti bowl that political scientists and economists refer to, of these kinds of arrangements. It's now become a very complicated set of arrangements and preferences where states are members of multiple areas of free trade, various levels of integration. And the membership in all of these areas, these connections between other countries, again, inherently constrains the arbitrary behavior. So the world is not quite as anarchic, not quite as driven by self-help and zero-sum activity as realists would suggest. In fact, we have a positive sum outcome because trade is inherently a positive sum enterprise. You trade with your trading partners, and you produce what you produce best, trade it for what you don't produce very well. You become and build a kind of mutual dependence on one another through these arrangements. And so you end up with this kind of spaghetti bowl that, again, kind of layers on top of the state and constrains a little bit of that arbitrary behavior. Because if you cut off that trade activity, you also are cutting yourself off. And so this is sort of the idea. This brings us to a set of liberal sub-theories that many of you have probably heard of, the democratic peace theory and commercial peace theory. Democratic peace theory is straightforward, that democracies don't fight one another. They're violent. They tend to go to war with non-democracies periodically, but they typically don't fight one another. Well, why is that? It's because you have norms of behavior between those democratic states, derived in part from the fact that there is some degree of accountability between the elected leadership of those states and those that put them there, the voters. And so voters tend not to like war very much. They don't like going to war. It's quite disruptive, as we all know. And so they tend to restrain their leaders from fighting one another. And so these norms develop between states, and liberal theorists like to point to these kinds of things as ways in which there is an interdependence among democratic states, this kind of prohibition on going to war against one another. And so democratic peace theorists look at this and they say, hey, here's a good example of where realism doesn't really play out, because you do not see even democratic states of varying degrees of power fighting one another. Similarly, commercial peace theory has also emerged as an area of research among scholars, primarily because they look at the depth and breadth of commercial ties among countries and say, it's unlikely that your biggest trading partner is going to fight you. It's unlikely that if you have deep commercial ties between two countries, that those two countries are going to go to war. And the best place to look at for good examples of this, and perhaps the quintessential example of this idea of the commercial peace theory, is Canada and the United States. Their economies are deeply intertwined, and so it's unlikely that they're ever going to go to war with one another. Canada probably wouldn't stand a chance, of course, in such a conflict, but the idea that the United States would ever invade Canada would be detrimental to the United States economically. And it's because the two economies are so deeply tied to one another, war has become completely unthinkable. Some look to China and Taiwan. Why has there not been any conflict across Taiwan Strait since the revolution in China? Why has there been, a relative peace, even though China claims that Taiwan is simply a province, a renegade province, and they will eventually come together and be unified? Well, a violent effort to reintegrate Taiwan into China's politics would be quite detrimental to both. The cross-strait economic ties between China and Taiwan mean that any kind of military action by China to retake Taiwan would actually hurt China quite significantly. the depth and breadth of cross-strait finance and trade is quite impressive. And so the two are unlikely to go to war with one another. I want to say a quick something about modernization theory. This is a theory that we typically see discussed in courses on comparative politics, but it also has some relevance here in the context of international political economy, in the sense that it really fuses together a couple of trends or themes regarding democracy and capitalism, liberalization of economies and liberalization in governance. And the central tenets of modernization theory are essentially that as your economy modernizes, becomes more sophisticated, deeper, spreads to more parts of your population, the pressures on political accountability move in lockstep. In other words, as your economy becomes more open, more liberalized, and greater proportions of your population get access to wealth and your per capita income rises, the pressures for accountability politically grow. And therefore, the link between liberalism and capitalism and openness in capitalism, free trade, a kind of liberal capitalist economy, then spill over into pressures toward liberalization in governance. And many people think that there is a real connection between the openness in liberal economies and the increasing democratization of certain societies. This is a controversial idea, of course, but a lot of folks, when they think about modernization theory, would point to South Korea, a country that in 1950 was easily one of the poorest on the planet, really has no natural resources to speak of, and yet now is a vibrant, modern capitalist society, freewheeling capitalist society that has eventually, by the late 1980s, also become solidly democratic. Again, this is a controversial point, but because we haven't seen it in other places, but the big sort of test, I suppose, of this right now that a lot of people have been watching for the last 20 or 30 years is China. As China has modernized and in many ways become more modern than parts of Western Europe or North America, we're sort of waiting to see if that process of modernization in economics will increasingly spill over and put pressure on the kind of politics that's practiced in China. Another set of ideas that we want to at least make reference to are both mercantilism and then also dependency theory. And let me sort of try to make the connection here in terms of the two. Dependency theory is something that many of you would have encountered in your basic international relations theory course. But I want to make the connection between that and mercantilism, which is very clearly an IPE topic. Mercantilism is associated with imperialism. It's associated with a positive balance of trade, meaning the kind of the mother country, if you want to put it that way, has a positive export balance, exports manufactured goods primarily to the colonies when we think about mercantilism and colonialism. They extract natural resources from those colonies, bring them to the sort of the imperial capital for reprocessing, transformation into various goods that are then re-exported to those colonial, the periphery of the colonies for sale. And so the home country, the colonialist power, reaps the benefits of having a positive export balance. And so you see this cycle depicted here. We have the colonies sending raw materials to, in this case, England, the colonial power. Then England transforms them. All their workers in England have good jobs, value-added processing. They send those finished goods back to the colonies. Well, this is connected to dependency theory in that scholars in the 1970s, certainly critics of modernization theory, which we just talked about, were kind of scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute, what about places like Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa that are profoundly rich in natural resources, and they never seem to quite take off in terms of that capitalist development and certainly that transformation of politics into a more kind of open, democratic kind of politics. These places seem stuck in those positions. And so dependency theorists came along and they basically made the argument, trying to figure out what was going on, and they made the argument that there's essentially a kind of dependency relationship between the core countries of the industrial north and the poorer developing countries of the less industrialized south, wherein essentially those southern countries, those less industrial southern countries, were extracting natural resources, sending them raw to the industrial north for processing, and then effectively having to buy those value-added exports from those same industrial countries. Not a pattern unfamiliar to those who have studied mercantilism or colonialism. So dependency theory has a lot of echoes of a kind of neo-colonial style of modern capitalism, in which the big dominant industrial countries essentially reap the benefits of openness in economics, whereas those developing countries really never quite catch up, because all they're doing is sending raw materials for north for value-added processing. And so you don't have this pattern of increased economic development and pressure then on the politics of those societies, and because they're stuck in this pattern, a kind of semi-colonial pattern of dependency on the developed north to. There are a number of other kind of systemic theories that scholars have put forward, and that you may have run into in studying international relations theory. And I'll just make brief mention of a couple of them here. One, structural realism. Realism, we've already talked about that, but among realists, they've been fighting it out, and there are different permutations of realism. And one of those is simply that the dominant powers have really structured the international system to work in their favor. So all of those organizations and phenomenon that liberal interdependence scholars point to as knitting the world together, as placing strictures on the arbitrary power, exercise of power by different countries, those scholars have all missed the boat. And the reality is that the big powers have structured all of those connections between countries to suit their interests. And so structural realism is just a set of structures, but states are still the big players that are driving everything. And so just want to mention that one, as well as hegemonic stability theory, which is down here as well. The idea that the world is more peaceable when you have a very large dominant country on the international scene. Contemporarily, it's the United States. In past epochs, it's been Great Britain. Control of the seas in terms of military power has been a major theme in all of that. But that you have global stability when you have a large, single, hegemonic power really driving politics. And some people are thinking about the rise of China in this context. What happens when you have a kind of dual hegemonic system, or a renewed bipolarity in the international system, similar to what we had in the Cold War? Are we inevitably headed for conflict at that stage? Or is it possible for those two systems, those two hegemons, to actually coexist? And so there are lots of other systemic theories out there that you should be aware of. Now here's where I might do some of the most abuse to some of the IR theories that you've encountered thus far in your studies in political science. But I'm going to unfairly and overly simplistically lump a bunch of things together and just say that once we move away from realism, liberalism, some of the neo-Marxist approaches to IR, then we get into some of the critical theories, the including feminism, that really take shots at some of those more traditional established theories. And one of the places that they begin, and this is really the punchline with all of these theories, and the reason that I want to kind of lump them all together, and I kind of tried to depict this on the billiard table here with the happy faces, is that it's really the people. The people that either are stuck between states, say refugees, or within states, looking within states. What is the socioeconomic structure of a state? What's the access to the political system that individuals have? What kind of influence do they have over the political system? And so my point with sort of lumping some of these critical theories together is that other theories miss a lot of this. They look traditionally at the state, at institutions, for example, at patterns of economic development and growth as the primary drivers of international relations. They treat the state as if it's a person. They personify the state in some fashion. And a lot of these theories say, wait a minute, this is really missing the boat in terms of what is driving international relations. Critical theorists, feminists, they would say, wait a minute, you're missing half of the planet if all you're doing is focusing on the great men that drive global politics. And what about the work that women do, for example? What about those social movement groups that have a big impact on the domestic politics, sometimes spilling over into international politics in terms of revolutions spilling over from one country to the next? Those are driven by people. And if our theories can't incorporate people, then they're missing something quite significant. And so that's really what the point that I'm trying to drive home here. By putting all of these little happy faces in amongst all of the institutions, the lattice work of connection between states and inside the states themselves. And so our traditional theories of international relations really fail to account for some of this. And they really treat the state as a kind of personified actor that has a kind of its self-interest, and that you can imbue the state with a kind of self-interest the way we would do with humans. And so feminists in particular are critical of this because a lot of the orientation of our theorizing about international relations is very male dominant. It's the great male leaders of many of our countries that are driving things. And, wait a minute, maybe we should be looking at the real foundation of some of our global politics and be looking more obviously at what women bring to the table, basically in terms of what the work is that they do in international relations. They are, in many cases, the heads of household, the primary wage earners in those households, huge economic impact on the countries that they're in, and yet they're kind of ignored. They're paid short shrift in terms of the way societies function and the way that they ultimately drive international politics. Cynthia Enloe is a very well-known author of feminist international relations. And one of her more interesting books is Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, looking at the work, including sex work, that a lot of women end up doing in and around military bases around the world. And so you have these overseas military installations by the United States, the Russians during the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. And what work or what contribution are the women that are engaged in helping do service contracting to those bases, are engaged in local employment to help keep those bases employed, and including some of the sex work that is provided to the military personnel. And so these are actors in international relations that are often left behind. So if we go back to the billiard table for just a minute, you can think also about this kind of theorizing about international relations as perhaps the state running over or crashing into a lot of the happy faces on the billiard table, meaning that they're essentially non-entities in some of our traditional theorizing about international relations. And so feminist scholars have really drawn a lot of attention to the role of women, minorities, those people that are often left on the sidelines of any traditional theorizing about international relations. And so their work has been very, very important in helping to drive that discussion to a more grassroots kind of level in terms of how we think about the functioning and operation of the international system. I want to make brief mention of Antonio Gramsci here for just a second. I categorize him as a kind of neo-Marxist, and Gramscian approaches to international relations have been very popular in the last decade or so. And the reason is that Gramsci starts with the proposition of asking, why didn't what Marx predicted would happen in terms of that clash between classes and class warfare ultimately materialize? Why haven't we seen that yet? And so Gramsci essentially postulates that the capitalist system has evolved in such a way as to develop a kind of false consciousness in people like you and I. We are not the big capitalist class. We are the proletariat, but we have been sold a bill of goods in terms of our ability to buy mutual funds, stocks, make it seem like you and I are part of the capitalist system, thereby developing a kind of false consciousness about our real place in the capitalist system. We are not the holders of capital. We are not the industrialists that can generate manufacturing. We're the employees. Yet we are made to feel through the purchase of our RRSPs and our mutual funds and our ability to buy stocks that somehow we are going to get rich too. We are part of that capitalist class. All of that has contributed to the elongation and the delay of this ultimate class conflict between the classes. And so Gramsci is an interesting way to begin thinking systemically about how the capitalist system has survived for so long in spite of its various crises, among those the Great Depression, the financial crisis of 2008, and even the one that we're in the midst of right now. And so how do we explain that? It's because of this idea of false consciousness, this idea that the proletariat, the working class, in some way has this belief that it too can be rich, it too can benefit from capitalism. Okay, the last theory that I want to kind of brush by and do a bit of a drive-by on is constructivism. Constructivism, admittedly, is something that every time I read a piece of constructivism, Alexander Wendt, for example, I get something totally different out of it. But the core thing that comes out of it all the time for me is this focus on ideas. That ideas and the values that evolve from them, the beliefs in a society, are socially constructed. And they may evolve over time. So understanding our relationships with other countries, understanding how the system functions, the international system of international relations, is heavily dependent on a set of fluid ideas, beliefs, and values. These are not things that are stuck or static or forever immovable. In fact, they evolve over time. And so our ability to understand where we are now may be dependent on the evolution of those values and ideas over time, but they may then also spill over into a new set of reconstructed ideas and values. And so conflict and cooperation are products of these values, these ideas, and they may not be static at any given point in time. And so there are no necessarily inviolable laws of international relations that can't change at some point. And so constructivists have brought something very important to the table in the consideration of these and the fluidity of these ideas, beliefs, and values in our international politics. I want to finish this set of slides with you today by considering zombies. Now, zombies and international relations don't seem like they should go together, and they don't. But this is actually the point. And it's the point of this book posted here on this slide, Zombies and Theories of International Politics by Daniel Drezner. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek in the sense that there are no zombies and we don't really ever have to consider them in the context of international relations theory. But the idea or the challenge that zombies present to our theorizing around international relations comes from the observation that Drezner made watching his kids play zombie attack video games. And as the zombies kind of laid waste to civilization, destroying institutions and laying, rampaging across the land, different countries, Drezner kind of sat and scratched his head and asked himself, well, if zombies were real, would there be theories of international relations that we currently have that could actually deal with them, could actually help us understand where they fit in the context of international relations? Zombies are a kind of non-state actor. They don't have a state. There's no zombie state, no country where the zombies came from. Zombies only have one purpose. You can't really bargain with zombies. You can't negotiate with zombies. They don't necessarily have a union that you can talk with and seek out their representatives. And so the point of this book is really to point out some of the weaknesses in how we begin theorizing. What's important in international relations? What are the units of analysis in international relations? Clearly, zombies, if they existed, we would have a difficult time incorporating them into our theories of international relations because we typically don't think of zombies as important units of analysis. But we've already talked a little bit about other scholars that have already looked at individuals, particularly women, marginalized groups, minorities, as having been left on the margins of a lot of our theorizing around international relations. And feminist scholars have been trying to work them into the mainstream of our considerations around international relations. But realism, liberal theory, interdependence, we really think about primarily the state and institutions, right? Bricks and mortar kinds of things. We personify the state. We have a sense of what the bricks and mortar institutions are. We can quantify the interdependence and flows of economic, financial flows, trade flows. We can measure that kind of interdependence. But then when we put in these actors that we're not used to considering in some of our more traditional theories, like zombies, we quickly see how weak some of our theories may be in incorporating the actors that really do drive our international system. And so Dresner's book is kind of funny. I invite you to pick it up and have a quick look at it. It's relatively short, but it does make a series of important points about each of our existing theories in international relations, the ones we've just been through, and the inability or maybe partial ability to incorporate a hypothetical zombie attack. And what it should do is raise for you some real questions about how well we are theorizing in international relations and how far our theories can take us in understanding how the international system works. Perhaps a bit more seriously than Daniel Dresner's treatment of zombies and international relations are some very well-known scholars of international political economy. Anne-Marie Slaughter, Susan Strange, and James Rosnow. Susan Strange is probably one of the best places you could start in thinking about the political economy of the state and the important restrictions that interdependence, the global financial system, trade have actually put on states, and how the state is essentially shrunk or become less robust than it used to be in the context of interdependence. We also have people like James Rosnow, who coined this awkward term fragmigration to sort of describe the competing pressures on the state of integration, right? So there's a lot of economic pressure to integrate with other societies, to reap the benefits of global capitalism for your own societies. But then also some of the fragmentation that comes with that, some of the dislocation that some of those same integrative forces also generate in terms of unsettling the state, unsettling the ability of the state to do certain things. And then, of course, you have Anne-Marie Slaughter, who coined the term the perforated state, meaning that the idea that the state is purely sovereign is a thing of the past because we have all of these connections between states. We have all of this connectivity economically, politically. The norms of behavior between states have become very robust, limiting the state's ability to act in a kind of self-interested fashion, perhaps even limiting the state's ability to act on behalf of some of its citizens, critics might say. And so there are all of these permutations, these authors that have taken a crack in one way or another at sort of adapting some of our thinking about international relations theory to international political economy. And so this has just been an overview to try to get you to re-stimulate some thinking about IR and where it fits in the context of international political economy and the spillover into much of what we're going to be talking about